Thrown out before winter, she built a slate tent for $0. Niels Torgren, who had survived 16 Minnesota winters, told her, "A woman alone cannot cut enough timber. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." She had $7, two children, and needed shelter she could not build. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. But 3 months earlier, Clara Holbrook had never lifted a stone heavier than a bread pan in her life. She arrived at the St. Louis River on the 15th of September, 1887, with two children, a canvas sack containing everything they owned, and $7.40. The wagon that had carried them from Duluth did not stop. The driver tossed their belongings onto the wet grass beside a stake marking the corners of a quarter section that had belonged to her husband until 3 weeks ago, when he had signed it over to her name and vanished toward the Montana goldfields without looking back. Clara stood in the rain and watched the wagon disappear down the rutted track. Her daughter Elsa, 6 years old, pressed against her leg. Her son Thomas, 4, sat in the mud and began to cry. The land stretched away in every direction, scrubby timber near the river, open meadow rising toward a ridge to the north, and nothing at all that resembled a house, a barn, or a neighbor. The nearest settlement was Thompson, 4 miles east. The nearest help was nowhere. She had never homesteaded. She had never farmed. She had never built anything more substantial than a chicken coop in Illinois, and even that had leaked. Her husband had promised Minnesota would be different. Rich soil, he said. Timber for building. Timber. A community of settlers who would help each other through the hard times. He had not mentioned that the hard times would begin the moment he left. The rain soaked through her wool coat. Thomas's crying turned to wailing. Elsa asked when Papa was coming back, and Clara said she did not know, which was the first honest thing she had told her children in weeks. That night they slept under the wagon canvas stretched between two birch saplings. Clara did not sleep at all. She listened to the wind in the pines and calculated what $7 could buy in Thompson. Not lumber. Lumber cost $20 for 1,000 board feet, and she needed at least 2,000 to frame even a small cabin. Not a stove. Stoves cost $30 or more. Not glass for windows, not nails by the keg, not the help of men who had their own claims to work and no reason to labor for a woman with nothing to trade. She had until December, maybe January, before the cold would kill them. The next morning she walked to Thompson, carrying Thomas and holding Elsa's hand. The town consisted of a general store, a blacksmith, a sawmill that had burned the previous spring and not been rebuilt, and a scattering of houses along the railroad track. Behind the general store, a group of men stood around a wagon loaded with cordwood, arguing about prices. Clara asked where she could find work. The storekeeper looked at her children, then at her mud-stained dress, then back at the men by the cordwood wagon. "Olaf Lindgren might need someone to cook for his logging crew," he said. "But that's 20 miles north, and he don't take families." "I have a claim," Clara said. 4 miles west along the river. I need to build before winter." The storekeeper's expression changed. Not to pity, exactly. Something more like the look a man gives a horse with a broken leg. "Ma'am," he said, "do you have any idea what winter means up here?" She did not. She had grown up in southern Illinois, where snow rarely lasted more than a week and temperatures seldom dropped below zero. She had heard stories about Minnesota winters, but stories were just words. She had no frame for what 0 degrees felt like, let alone 20 below, let alone 40 below. "I can learn," she said. The storekeeper called over one of the men from the cordwood wagon. He was in his 60s, thick through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been carved from oak. His name was Niels Torgren, and he had homesteaded along the St. Louis River since 1871. 16 winters in Carlton County. 16 winters in a region where 3 years earlier, the temperature had dropped to 46 degrees below zero and stayed there for a week. Torgrim listened as Clara explained her situation. Her husband's abandonment, the quarter section in her name, her need to build shelter before snow. When she finished, Torgrim was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke in an accent that flattened his vowels and sharpened his consonants, the cadence of a man who had learned English late and never fully trusted it. "A woman alone cannot cut enough timber," he said. "You'll need 8 cords minimum for a cabin that size, and another 10 cords for fuel through winter. You cannot fell trees with children underfoot. You cannot notch logs without a partner to lift them. And even if you could, you have no team to drag the timber, no saw to mill the boards, no money to buy what you cannot make." He paused. "You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." Clara felt her face flush, not from embarrassment, from anger. She had heard men dismiss her capabilities before. Her husband had done it constantly. But Torgrim's voice carried no malice. He was stating facts the way he might state the weight of a cord of wood or the price of flour. He was not trying to hurt her. He simply believed she was already dead. "Then what should I do?" she asked. Torgrim shrugged. "Go back to Duluth. Find work as a domestic. Give up the claim. It happens every year. People come out here thinking they can homestead, and the land proves them wrong. There is no shame in it. The shame is in staying until the cold takes you." Clara looked at her children. Thomas had found a stick and was drawing patterns in the dirt. Elsa was watching the men stack cordwood, her expression unreadable. "I won't give up my land," Clara said. Torgrim studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he understands that further argument is pointless. "Then God help you," he said, "because no one else will." She spent her first 3 weeks on the claim trying to build a dugout. The site seemed perfect, a hillside near the river with a south-facing slope and soil that appeared soft enough to dig. She had read about dugouts in a pamphlet on homesteading that her husband had left behind. Excavate a chamber into the hillside, frame the front with logs, roof it with poles and sod. Cheap, fast, and warm. Settlers had survived entire winters in dugouts 12 feet square. What the pamphlet did not mention was that digging into a Minnesota hillside in October was like digging into stone. The first foot of soil came up easily enough. Clara used a flat rock as a makeshift shovel, scraping the dirt loose and carrying it away in her apron. But below that first foot, the earth changed character. It became dense, root-laced, packed so hard that her rock shovel bounced off instead of biting in. By the end of the first week, she had excavated a hollow roughly 6 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 3 feet high. Barely large enough for the children to sit in, let alone sleep. Her hands were blistered raw. Her shoulders ached so badly she could not lift Thomas without wincing. She needed tools, a proper spade, a mattock for breaking through roots, a pickaxe for the clay layer she could see just below where she had stopped. She had $7. A spade cost $2. A mattock cost $3. A pickaxe cost $4. Together they would cost more than she had, leaving nothing for food. She could buy tools, or she could eat. She could not do both. At night, in the cramped hollow she had carved from the hillside, Clara made lists by firelight. What she needed, what she had, what the gap between them meant. The lists grew longer each night, and the gap grew wider. 3 weeks into October, the first frost arrived. Clara woke to find ice crystals on the canvas they used for a roof, and both children shivering despite the wool blankets piled over them. The fire had burned down to coals. She rebuilt it with shaking hands and watched the frost melt off the grass as the sun rose, and she understood with perfect clarity that her dugout would not be finished in time. She had dug perhaps 1/5 of the volume she needed. At her current pace, the excavation alone would take another 2 months, and that assumed the ground did not freeze solid, which it would, probably within weeks. Then she would need logs for the front wall, poles for the roof, sod for insulation. She had no logs. She had no way to get logs. A single pine tree 20 feet tall weighed hundreds of pounds and required a team of oxen to drag. Niels Torgren had been right. The math did not work. It had never worked. Clara sat by the fire and watched her children sleep and tried to imagine what came next. Going back to Duluth, as Torgren had suggested, she had no money for lodging, no references for domestic work, no family to take them in. Her husband had isolated her systematically over 5 years of marriage, cutting her off from friends, from her parents, from anyone who might have helped when he finally left. She had nothing in Duluth but the memory of promises broken. She could not go back. She could not stay. She could not build. She could not buy. The fire crackled. The children breathed, and Clara Holbrook stared into the coals and waited for an answer that would not come. The river changed everything. She had gone to the St. Louis to wash clothes. The last clean dress she owned was now brown with mud and pine sap, and the children's things were worse. The October sun was pale, but warm enough that she could work barefoot in the shallows without her feet going numb. She had chosen a spot where the river widened over a series of ledges, the water running shallow and fast between exposed beds of dark rock. The rock was unusual, not the rounded boulders she remembered from Illinois, but flat slabs, layered like pages in a book, with smooth faces and sharp edges where pieces had broken away. Thomas was stacking them on the bank. He had been collecting flat rocks all morning, building towers that collapsed and rebuilding them, his small face intent with concentration. Clara watched him place one slab on top of another, then another, then another. 5 stones high, 6, 7. The tower wobbled but held. "Look, Mama," he said. "It's a house." Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked up the bank to where Thomas crouched beside his tower. The stones were dark gray, almost black, with a faint sheen like polished iron. They stacked perfectly, flat against flat, no gaps, no wobble. She picked one up and felt its weight. Dense, but not impossible. 10 pounds, maybe 12. The size of a dinner plate and about an inch thick. "What are these?" Elsa asked. She had abandoned the laundry and joined her brother, already gathering more flat stones from the riverbank. Clara did not know. She had never seen rock like this. She picked up another piece and examined it, the way it split along clean parallel planes, the way the surfaces were almost glassy smooth, the way the edges broke in straight lines rather than crumbling. She remembered something from a childhood trip to a slate quarry in Vermont. Her father had been buying roofing material. The quarrymen had showed her how the stone split, how they could cleave it into sheets thin enough to write on. This rock looked exactly the same. Slate. The river was cutting through a bed of slate. Clara stood at the water's edge and looked upstream, where the ledges continued as far as she could see, dark slabs tilted at an angle, emerging from the riverbed like the spines of buried books. There were hundreds of them, thousands, an inexhaustible supply of flat, stackable stone piled along the banks and scattered across the shallows, already broken into pieces she could lift. She thought about the dugout that would never be finished. She thought about the logs she could not fell and the lumber she could not buy, and the men who would not help. Then she thought about the beehive huts she had seen in a book once, ancient stone shelters in Ireland built without mortar, their walls curving inward until they met at the top. She had thought they looked primitive, crude, the kind of thing people built when they had nothing else. She had nothing else. Clara picked up a flat slab of slate, carried it to dry ground, and set it down. Then she went back for another. By sunset, she had carried over 200 stones from the riverbank to a level spot on the ridge above her failed dugout. Her back screamed. Her arms hung limp. But the pile of slate was impressive. Dark gray slabs sorted roughly by size, the largest at the bottom, the smallest on top. She did not know yet what shape she would build. She did not know how to stack stone without mortar. She did not know if slate could hold heat, if flat stones could form walls, if anything she was imagining was even possible. But for the first time since her husband left, she felt something other than despair. She felt the beginning of a plan. Over the next 3 days, Clara experimented. She stacked stones into walls and watched them collapse. She tried leaning 2 walls against each other and found they held better. The angle transferred weight downward instead of outward. She discovered that large stones needed to overlap smaller stones to bridge the gaps, that small stones wedged into cracks stopped larger stones from shifting, that a pile of slate arranged with care could become a structure that resisted her push, an A-frame. That was the shape that worked. 2 walls leaning together, propping each other up, meeting at a ridgeline like the roof of a tent. No need for vertical walls that wanted to fall over. No need for mortar to hold stones in place. Just gravity and angle and the patient accumulation of weight. On the 4th day, a man appeared on the trail above her claim. His name was Henrik Dahl, and he was Norwegian, like most of the settlers in Carleton County. He had a farm 3 miles north near the Thompson Road, and he had heard from Torgrim that a woman was trying to homestead alone along the river. He had come to see if the rumors were true. He found Clara on her knees beside the beginning of a stone wall, 2 courses high, 8 feet long, already showing the distinctive inward lean of an A-frame. "What is this?" Dahl asked. Clara stood and wiped slate dust from her hands. "A shelter," she had, "for winter." Dahl walked around the structure's foundation, studying the arrangement of stones. He was younger than Torgrim, perhaps 40, with a neatly trimmed beard, and the careful gaze of a man who measured twice before cutting. "You are building this from river rock," he said, "without mortar. The slate stack's flat. It holds together if I lap the joints." Dahl frowned. He picked up one of her larger slabs, tested its weight, set it down. "Slate is cold stone," he said. "It drinks heat and gives nothing back. In Norway, we build with wood and plaster clay over the inside walls to hold warmth. Stone is for foundations, not living spaces. You will freeze in here." "I'll build a fire inside." "The smoke will kill you before the cold does. Slate does not breathe like sod or timber. The fumes will have nowhere to go." Clara pointed to the ridgeline she was planning. "I'll leave a gap at the top. The smoke rises out. The heat stays in the walls." Dahl's frown deepened. He was a practical man. Clara could see that from the way he examined her work, testing the stability of each course, checking the angle of the lean. He was not dismissing her out of cruelty. He was trying to understand how her design could possibly function. "How long to build this?" he asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I've been averaging 40 stones a day. The structure needs perhaps 600 more. And then winter comes and you discover the slate loses heat faster than you can make it. What then?" Clara had no answer. She did not know if slate held heat. She had no experience with thermal mass, no understanding of the physics involved. All she had was the memory of that pamphlet illustration, the Irish beehive huts that had sheltered monks for hundreds of years, and the hope that stone, which stayed cold in summer, might stay warm in winter if she could just get it hot enough. "I don't have another option," she said. Dahl looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elsa and Thomas, who were sitting on a log nearby, watching the adults with the wariness children develop when they have seen too many arguments. "You're gambling your children's lives on a pile of rocks," Dahl said. "I am gambling their lives on the only thing I can build." Dahl shook his head slowly. "Then build it fast," he said, "and pray the winter is mild, because if it is not—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. October became November. The leaves fell from the birches, and the days grew short, and Clara Holbrook carried stone from the river until her hands cracked and bled. The structure rose slowly, 2 feet, then 3 feet, then 4. The A-frame's walls leaned inward at a steep angle, each course of slate stepping slightly closer to the center line than the course below. By the first week of November, the walls were 5 feet tall at the peak, and the interior space was beginning to feel enclosed. A dark triangle roughly 8 feet long, 5 feet wide at the base, narrowing to nothing at the top. She left an opening at one end for a door and a gap at the apex for smoke. She chinked the cracks between stones with river mud mixed with dead grass, pressing the paste into every seam until the walls were nearly airtight. The work was tedious and cold, her fingers numb within minutes, the mud freezing before she could spread it, but each sealed crack made the interior a little darker, a little more protected from the wind that now carried the edge of winter. The physical cost was visible. Her dress hung loose. Her face had thinned. The blisters on her hands had become calluses, then cracked open again, then scabbed over into hard ridges that split when she flexed her fingers. She ate 1 meal a day and gave the rest to the children. She slept 4 hours a night and worked the remaining 20. She knew she was destroying her body. She also knew that stopping meant death. On the 9th of November, Margaret Hensley arrived. Margaret was the wife of a railroad surveyor who had mapped Carleton County in 1873. She lived in Thompson now, a widow of 2 years, and she ran an informal exchange among the settlement's women. Eggs traded for butter, labor traded for goods, information shared across the miles that separated homesteads. She had heard about Clara from Henrik Dahl. Everyone had heard about Clara by now. The woman building a stone tent by the river. The woman too stubborn or too stupid to see that she was killing herself and her children for nothing. Margaret brought food, a sack of flour, a jar of lard, a smoked ham hock. She did not offer them as charity. She offered them as a trade. "I need someone to watch my geese over Christmas," Margaret said. "My sister in Duluth is expecting her 4th, and I want to be there for the birth. A week, maybe 10 days. I'll leave you the key to my house and the run of my pantry." Clara looked at the food. Enough to feed her family for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if she stretched it. She looked at Margaret, a woman in her 50s with gray streaking her hair, and the careful posture of someone who had learned not to offer help too openly. "I can't leave the claim," Clara said. "Not for a week. The shelter isn't finished." Margaret nodded. "I know. The goose house is 30 feet from my back door. You can stay in my house while I'm gone. Warm beds, a proper stove. Then you come back here and finish your pile of rocks." It was charity disguised as transaction. Clara understood that. Margaret did not need someone to watch her geese. Geese watched themselves, but accepting charity directly would wound Clara's pride and make her a dependent, a failure, someone who could not manage on her own. This way, the help came wrapped in the fiction of equal exchange. Clara's pride told her to refuse. Her children's sunken cheeks told her something else. "When?" she asked. "December 15th. Back by Christmas, God willing." Clara nodded. "I'll be there." Margaret looked at the slate structure, now nearly 6 feet high, its dark walls absorbing the thin November light. She did not say anything about it. She did not predict failure or offer advice. She simply studied the A-frame the way a woman studies another woman's needlework, noting the care, the effort, the intention behind the craft. "You might make it," Margaret said quietly. Clara was not sure if she meant the shelter or the winter. She did not ask. By the 20th of November, the structure was complete. It stood on the ridge above the river, an angular shadow against the gray sky, 8 feet long, 5 feet wide at the base, 6 feet tall at the peak. The walls were solid slate, nearly 8 inches thick where she had doubled the layers. The door opening faced south, away from the prevailing wind. The smoke gap at the ridgeline was narrow, just wide enough for fumes to escape, not wide enough to lose significant heat. Clara had lined the interior floor with flat stones as well, creating a foundation that would not turn to mud when snow melted off their boots. She had laid a fire pit in the center, a shallow depression bordered by larger slabs, positioned so the flames would rise directly toward the smoke gap, while the heat spread outward to the surrounding walls. She had carried, by her rough count, over 900 stones from the riverbank. She had lost 15 pounds. She had worn through one pair of shoes completely and started on the second. Her hands looked like they belonged to a woman twice her age. But the shelter was built. She lit the first fire on November 21st. The children huddled behind her as the flames caught, as smoke rose toward the gap and eddied against the stone walls before finding its way out. For a terrible moment she thought Dahl had been right. The smoke would fill the space, would suffocate them, would prove that everything she had built was a death trap. Then the draft caught. The smoke pulled upward, streaming through the gap in a thin column. The interior cleared, and Clara felt something she had not expected. Heat. Not the heat of a fire, she had expected that. A different heat. A slower heat. The stones around her were warming. She could feel it against her face, against her hands, radiating from the dark slate surfaces like warmth from a brick pulled out of a bread oven. The fire was heating the walls, and the walls were holding the heat, and the heat was bouncing back into the interior from every direction at once. She let the fire burn for 2 hours, then let it die to coals. The children fell asleep in the warmth, their blankets thrown off, their faces peaceful for the first time in weeks. Clara stayed awake, pressing her palm against the stone walls, feeling the heat that lingered there, 4 hours after the fire died, 5 hours, 6. At midnight, the interior was still noticeably warmer than the air outside. Not warm, exactly, but survivable. The cold that had been seeping into her bones since September had retreated, at least for now. She did not know the science. She did not know that slate's specific heat capacity allowed it to absorb energy quickly, or that its low thermal conductivity prevented that energy from escaping. She did not know about radiant heat, about infrared wavelengths, about the physics that would later be codified in building science textbooks. She only knew what she could feel. The stone held heat. The stone gave it back. She had been right. The victory lasted 3 days. On November 24th, Garrett Price rode up to her claim on a bay mare and sat in the saddle looking down at her slate shelter with an expression of pure contempt. Price was the land agent for the Northern Pacific Railway, which held title to alternating sections of land throughout Carleton County under the Federal Railroad grants. His job was to sell those sections to settlers at $2.50 per acre, a price that included, he claimed, the civilizing benefits of railroad access. His unofficial job was to discourage homesteading on the free public sections, which reduced the value of his company's adjacent holdings. Clara's quarter section was public land. Price wanted it empty. "Mrs. Holbrook," he said, not dismounting, "I've been asked to inform you that your structure violates county building codes." "There are no county building codes," Clara said. "Carleton County isn't organized yet." Price smiled thinly. "An oversight that will be corrected shortly." In the meantime, the territorial health officer has expressed concern that he paused, searching for a word. Your pile of rocks may pose a hazard to nearby residents. Carbon dioxide accumulation, structural collapse, vermin infestation, the usual concerns. There are no nearby residents. The nearest homestead is Henrik Dahl's place, 3 miles north. Mr. Dahl has expressed concern. Clara felt cold spread through her chest. I don't believe that. Price's smile widened. Whether you believe it or not, the territorial officer will be making an inspection within the week. If your structure is found to be hazardous, you'll be required to vacate the claim until proper improvements can be made. He tipped his hat. Good day, Mrs. Holbrook. He rode away without waiting for a response. Clara watched him go, her hands clenched at her sides. A territorial inspection meant a bureaucrat from St. Paul who knew nothing about frontier construction and everything about collecting bribes. A finding of hazard meant a legal order to abandon her claim, and once she was off the land, Price could file a competing entry claiming her improvements had been abandoned. It was theft wrapped in law. It was the kind of thing that happened to single women, to widows, to anyone without a man to threaten on their behalf. She had 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the inspector arrived. If the shelter failed before then, if it collapsed, if it filled with smoke, if one of her children got sick, Price would have the evidence he needed. Everything depended on the Slate holding together. Masserat, the temperature dropped 17 degrees overnight on November 29th. Clara woke to frost on the inside of the door flap and her breath crystallizing in the air above her face. The fire had burned down to ash hours ago. The children were burrowed under every blanket they owned, their forms barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, but the walls were still warm. She pressed her hand against the slate, felt the residual heat from last night's fire radiating through the stone. Not hot, she could keep her palm there indefinitely, but noticeably warmer than the frigid air. The temperature inside the shelter was perhaps 20 degrees warmer than outside. Not comfortable, but alive. She rebuilt the fire and fed it until the flames roared against the stone. The walls absorbed the heat visibly. She could see the frost melting where firelight struck the slate, could feel the surfaces warming under her touch. Within an hour, the interior was almost pleasant. The children woke and ate oatmeal without their fingers turning blue. This was the pattern for the next 2 weeks. Fire in the morning, fire in the evening, the walls holding heat through the hours between. She learned to judge the stones by touch. Warm meant safety. Cold meant danger. She learned which walls absorbed heat fastest and which released it slowest. She learned that feeding the fire for 3 hours built enough thermal mass to last through the night, that 2 hours was not quite enough, that 4 hours was wasteful when wood was limited. She had perhaps a cord and a half of firewood scavenged from deadfall and scrub pine along the river, enough for 3 weeks of careful burning, not enough for a full winter. But winter hadn't truly arrived yet. December 2nd brought 3 inches of snow. December 5th brought 6 more. The temperature dropped again, then again, then again, 20 below zero on December 7th, holding there for 2 days before climbing back to a mere 10 below. Clara stopped checking the thermometer she had bought in Thompson with her last $2. The numbers no longer meant anything. Cold was cold. Survival was the only metric that mattered. And then, on December 11th, Niels Torgren appeared at her door. The old Norwegian stood in the snow outside her slate shelter, his face half hidden by a wool scarf, his eyes taking in the structure she had built. He did not speak for a long moment. "You're still alive," he finally said. "We are." "The children?" "Healthy. Warm enough." Torgren walked slowly around the shelter, examining the walls, the joints, the smoke gap at the apex. He brushed snow from a section of slate and pressed his palm against the stone. His expression changed. "The rock holds heat," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "6 hours after the fire dies. Sometimes 8 if I burn it long enough." Torgren was silent. He completed his circuit of the shelter and returned to face her. His eyes, which had been flat with skepticism at their first meeting, now held something different. Not respect exactly, not yet, but the beginning of doubt, doubt in his own certainty. "I told you that you would freeze," he said. "You did." "I was wrong about the stone." He paused. "I do not know if I was wrong about the rest." "What do you mean?" Torgren looked past her, toward the horizon, where dark clouds were massing in the northwest. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying a cold that felt different from the cold they had endured so far. Deeper, more final. "There's a storm coming," Torgren said. "A bad one. I can smell it. My bones can feel it. The Ojibwe have a name for this kind of storm, but I will not say it. The word itself brings bad luck." "When?" "Soon. A week, maybe less, maybe sooner." He met her eyes. "Your shelter may hold heat, Mrs. Holbrook, but this stone has never faced a true Minnesota winter. None of us know what happens when the temperature drops to 40 below, and the wind screams for 3 days straight, and the snow piles higher than a man's head." Clara felt the cold that had nothing to do with weather. "What should I do?" Torgren shook his head. "Pray," he said. "Stockwood, stay inside, and hope that your pile of rocks is stronger than everything I know about winter." He turned and walked away through the snow, his footprints filling almost as fast as he made them. Clara watched him go. Then she looked at the clouds building in the northwest, dark and massive and moving faster than clouds should move. The real test was coming, and she had no idea if her shelter would survive it. The week before Christmas passed in a blur of wood gathering and wall checking and weather watching. Clara spent December 12th through 14th at Margaret Hensley's house in Thompson, watching the geese and sleeping in a real bed for the first time since September. The children played with Margaret's collection of carved wooden animals. They ate meals that included vegetables and butter and fresh bread from the Thompson bakery. For 3 days they lived like normal people. Then Clara went back to the river. The shelter stood exactly as she had left it, dark and angular against the snow, smoke rising from the apex where the morning fire still burned. She had asked a neighbor's son to tend the flames while she was gone, paying him 50 cents to keep the walls warm. The boy had done his job. The interior temperature, when she stepped inside, was almost comfortable, but the weather had changed. The clouds Torgren had warned about still hung in the northwest, but they had grown. The mass now stretched from horizon to horizon, a wall of gray-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The temperature had dropped steadily since December 10th, 15 below on the 12th, 20 below on the 14th, 23 below on the morning of December 15th. Clara checked her wood supply. 1 cord remained stacked against the shelter's north wall under a canvas tarp. At her current burn rate, 3 hours of strong fire morning and evening, the cord would last perhaps 12 days. If she stretched it, burning less and wearing more clothing, she might make it to 18. The calendar said winter had not yet begun. The solstice was still 6 days away. She rationed the fires. 2 hours in the morning, 2 in the evening, sleeping under every blanket they owned. The walls held heat adequately. The interior never dropped below 15 degrees warmer than outside, but 15 degrees warmer than 20 below was still 5 below zero. The children wore their coats to bed. Clara wore everything she owned. Christmas came and went without celebration. She told Elsa and Thomas that Santa could not find them this year because they had moved, But next year would be different. They accepted the lie with the weary patience of children who had stopped expecting good things. December 28th brought the territorial inspector. His name was Warren Hodge, and he arrived in a sleigh driven by Garrett Price. The two men stood outside Clara's shelter while she waited in the doorway, her children behind her, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Hodge was a thin man with spectacles and a clipboard. He walked around the structure once, made notes, peered through the door opening without entering, made more notes. His expression revealed nothing. "Unusual construction," he said finally. "It works," Clara replied. "So I see." Hodge consulted his clipboard. "Mr. Price has filed a complaint alleging that this structure poses a health hazard due to inadequate ventilation and structural instability." "Mr. Price wants my land." Price's face tightened, but he said nothing. Hodge looked at the shelter again. He looked at the thin column of smoke rising from the apex. He looked at Elsa and Thomas, who were clearly not dead from carbon dioxide poisoning or crushed by collapsed walls. "The complaint appears to be without merit," he said. "The structure shows evidence of adequate ventilation and sound construction. I will file my report accordingly." He climbed back into the sleigh. Price followed, his jaw set with fury. As the sleigh pulled away, Price looked back at Clara with an expression that promised this was not finished. But for now, she had won. January arrived like a door slamming shut. The temperature on New Year's Day was 31 degrees below zero. Clara burned wood for 4 hours straight, depleting her reserves faster than she had planned, but the alternative was frostbite. The children stayed inside wrapped in blankets, playing quiet games with stones and sticks while the wind howled outside. Her wood supply dropped to 3/4 of a cord, then half a cord, then less. She began burning smaller fires, letting the shelter cool further between heating cycles. The walls still held warmth. That miracle had not changed, but the baseline temperature dropped each day. 20 degrees warmer than outside became 15, then 12, then 10. On January 7th, Thomas developed a cough. It started as nothing, a tickle in his throat, a slight rasp when he breathed. Children coughed all the time. Clara gave him warm water with honey scraped from the bottom of a jar Margaret had given her, and he seemed better by evening. By January 9th, he was worse. The cough had deepened into something that rattled in his chest. His forehead was hot to the touch. He refused food and wanted only to sleep, curled in a ball under the blankets, his small body shaking with each coughing fit. Clara knew what this was. She had seen it in Illinois, had lost a nephew to it 3 winters ago. The croup, people called it, though doctors had fancier names. An inflammation of the lungs that could kill a child in days if it progressed, or pass harmlessly if it did not. She needed to keep him warm. That was the only treatment, warmth and rest and prayer. Keep the fever from climbing too high. Keep the cough from tearing his lungs apart. Keep him alive until his body fought off whatever had invaded it. She burned more wood. 4 hours, 5 hours, 6. The shelter's interior climbed to 50 degrees, then 55, warmer than it had been since she first lit a fire in November. Thomas stopped shivering. His breathing eased slightly. The cough remained, but it no longer sounded like something dying. Her wood supply dropped to a 1/4 cord. On January 10th, the weather broke. The temperature climbed from 25 below to 0, then to 10 above, then to an almost miraculous 20 degrees above 0. The sun emerged. The snow sparkled. Clara stood outside the shelter and felt warmth on her face for the first time in weeks. Thomas improved with the weather. His cough loosened. His appetite returned. By the evening of January 11th, he was sitting up and asking for stories, his fever broken, his eyes bright again. Clara allowed herself to hope. The worst was over. Her wood would last another week, maybe more if the mild weather held. She could scavenge deadfall, rebuild her supply, survive until spring. Then she saw Henrik Dahl running toward her claim. He was not a man who ran. In 3 months of knowing him, Clara had never seen Dahl move faster than a deliberate walk. But now he was sprinting through the snow, his coat flapping open, his breath trailing behind him in ragged clouds. "Get inside," he shouted. "Get inside now. Close every gap. Do not come out for anything." Clara grabbed his arm as he reached her. "What is it? What's happening?" Dahl pointed northwest. The sky had changed. Where the morning had been clear and bright, the horizon now showed a wall of darkness, not clouds exactly, but something denser, something that seemed to swallow the light entirely. It stretched from the ground to the heavens, and it was moving toward them faster than anything Clara had ever seen. "The storm," Dahl gasped, "the one Torgren warned about. It is here." Clara looked at the wall of darkness. It was closer already, miles closer than it had been seconds ago. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it against her face, the warmth of the morning vanishing as if someone had opened a door to the void. "How long?" she asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Dahl was already backing away toward his own claim 3 miles north. "Stay inside. Do not open the door. If you have wood, burn it. All of it. Do not save anything for tomorrow." "I only have a quarter cord left." Dahl stopped. For a moment, his face showed something like despair. "Then God help you," he said. And he ran. The storm hit at 2:30 in the afternoon on January 12th, 1888. Clara had just sealed the door with the canvas flap and every blanket she could spare. The children were huddled by the fire pit, Thomas still weak from his illness, Elsa holding her brother with the fierce protectiveness of a 6-year-old who understood more than she should. The first gust struck the shelter like a physical blow. The walls shuddered. Stone ground against stone. Clara heard a sound she had never heard before, the wind not whistling but screaming, a high-pitched shriek that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The canvas over the door bowed inward, straining against the stones she had piled to hold it, threatening to tear free. Then the temperature fell. She felt it happen, not a gradual cooling but a plunge, as if she had stepped off a cliff into frozen water. The air inside the shelter, which had been 50 degrees moments ago, dropped to 40, then 30, then colder. Clara threw wood on the fire. Every piece she could grab piled onto the flames until they roared against the stone walls. The heat pushed back against the cold, but the cold pushed harder. 25 degrees inside, 20, 15. The wind found gaps she had not known existed. Cold air poured through cracks in the door seal. Through tiny spaces between stones she thought she had chinked, through the smoke gap at the apex that now admitted snow and wind along with the rising smoke. She stuffed the gaps with clothing, socks, spare dresses, her own coat, anything that could block the wind. The fire consumed wood at a terrifying rate. A quarter cord would last days under normal conditions. At this burn rate, it would be gone in hours. Thomas coughed. The sound was worse than before, wet and deep, the cough of a child whose lungs had not finished healing. The cold was undoing everything the past 2 days of warmth had accomplished. The temperature outside dropped to 0, then 10 below, then 20 below. The walls of the shelter, which had been radiating stored heat, began to cool. Clara could feel it against her palm, the warmth fading. the stone surrendering to the cold that pressed against it from every direction. She burned more wood, half her remaining supply gone in the first hour. The fire blazed. The walls absorbed heat. The temperature inside stabilized at 20 degrees, cold enough to see her breath, cold enough for the children to shiver under their blankets, but not cold enough to kill. Not yet. Outside, the storm screamed. The snow was not falling. It was flying horizontally, driven by winds that Clara later learned exceeded 50 miles per hour. The flakes were not flakes at all, but ice crystals, fine as flour, so small and so fast they penetrated every gap, every crack, every imperfect seal. Snow accumulated on the floor of the shelter, despite the door being closed. It coated the blankets, the children's hair, Clara's eyelashes when she blinked too slowly. She burned more wood. 3 hours into the storm, 2/3 of her supply was gone. The fire had become the only thing that mattered, feeding it, tending it, watching the flames that stood between her children and death. Thomas's coughing worsened. Each fit shook his entire body, leaving him gasping and pale. Clara held him against her chest, sharing her warmth, counting his breaths. If the cough became croup again, if his airways swelled shut, there was nothing she could do. No doctor within miles, no medicine, only heat and hope. The temperature outside dropped to 30 below, then 35 below, then 40 below. Clara ran out of wood at 9 o'clock that night. The last log went onto the fire, and she watched it burn with the knowledge that nothing would follow it. The flames would die, the coals would cool, the walls would surrender their stored heat, and the cold would claim them. She had failed. The fire burned for another hour, then began to fade. The flames shrank to tongues, then to flickers, then to nothing but orange coals pulsing in the darkness. The temperature inside the shelter began its final descent. 30 degrees, 25, 20. Clara pulled the children close, Elsa on one side, Thomas on the other, all three of them wrapped in every blanket they owned. She could feel their bodies shaking. She could hear Thomas's ragged breathing, worse with each passing minute. She could see nothing. The fire was dead. The night was absolute, and the storm outside had blotted out the stars. She thought about Niels Torgren's warning. You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you. She thought about her husband, somewhere in Montana, probably warm beside a fire he had not built with his own hands. She thought about her mother, dead 3 years now, who had told her once that a woman's strength was in her stubbornness, the refusal to accept what everyone said was inevitable. The temperature inside the shelter dropped to 15 degrees, then 10, and then it stopped. Clara waited for the cold to continue its descent, waited for the final plunge to 0, to 10 below, to the temperature that would freeze the moisture in their lungs and stop their hearts. It did not come. She pressed her hand against the wall beside her. The stone was cool but not cold, not the bone-deep cold of a January night at 40 below. Something warmer, something that pushed back against her palm with the faintest radiation of heat. The fire had been dead for an hour. The coals had gone dark. There was no source of warmth anywhere in the shelter, except the walls themselves. 6 hours of burning, 6 hours of flames pouring heat into 8 inches of slate stacked in a careful A-frame. The stone had absorbed it all, every BTU, every degree, every bit of energy the fire could produce. And now, with the fire gone, the stone was giving it back. Slowly, steadily, degree by degree. The temperature inside the shelter held at 10 degrees above 0, while the temperature outside plunged to 45 below. A 55-degree difference, maintained by nothing but rock and physics, and the desperate labor of a woman who had carried 900 stones from a riverbank because she had no other choice. Thomas's coughing eased. The warmth, such as it was, allowed his lungs to relax, allowed him to breathe without fighting for every breath. Elsa stopped shivering. Clara felt the tension in her own body release, the death grip of cold loosening just enough to let her think. They were not warm, they were not comfortable, they were not safe, but they were alive. The storm lasted 3 days. For 72 hours, the wind screamed and the snow flew, and the temperature never climbed above 30 below. Clara dozed in fragments, waking every few hours to check the children's breathing, to press her hand against the walls, to confirm that the heat still lingered. It did. Hour after hour, the slate released the energy it had stored. The interior temperature fluctuated between 0 and 15 degrees, cold enough to be miserable, warm enough to survive. By the second day, Clara understood the rhythm. The walls cooled fastest in the first hours after the fire died, then slowed as the temperature differential decreased. The last traces of warmth persisted longest, radiating from the stone like the final glow of a sunset. She had no more wood. She could not rebuild the fire. All she could do was wait and hope that the storm ended before the walls surrendered the last of their heat. On the morning of January 15th, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that Clara thought she had gone deaf. She pushed aside the frozen canvas over the door and stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow was waist-deep and still. The sky was clear, the sun blinding on the white expanse. The temperature was 22 degrees below zero. Brutal by any normal standard, but after 3 days of 40 below, it felt almost mild. She looked at her shelter. Snow had piled against the walls, burying the lower courses, but the structure stood exactly as she had built it. The slate had not cracked. The walls had not collapsed. The gaps she had chinked with mud and grass had held against wind that could knock a man off his feet. The stone tent had survived. Clara turned to look north, toward Henrik Dahl's farm. Smoke should have been rising from his chimney. She saw nothing but white. She looked east, toward Thompson. The town was invisible behind drifts that rose higher than her head. She looked south, toward the river. The water had frozen solid, the current trapped beneath ice that groaned and cracked in the sudden stillness. And she saw a figure moving toward her across the snow. Niels Torgren looked like a man who had walked out of his own grave. His face was gray with frostbite. His hands, when he removed his mittens, were white at the fingertips, the first stage of the damage that would later cost him 2 fingers on his left hand. He had walked 4 miles through waist-deep snow from his homestead near the Thompson Road, and he had walked because his horse was dead. "The barn collapsed," he said. His voice was flat, empty of everything except exhaustion. "Second night, the weight of the snow. I heard the timbers break, but I could not reach them. The horse, the cow, my pigs, all dead under the roof." Clara brought him inside the shelter. She had nothing to offer, no fire, no food, only the residual warmth of walls that had saved her life. Torgren sat on the stone floor and stared at the dark fire pit and said nothing for a long time. "The Henriksen family," he finally said. "A mile west of me. 7 children. Their cabin was frame construction, and the wind found a gap between the logs. They stuffed it with rags, but the cold came through anyway. By the second night, the children were burning furniture. By the third night, they were burning the walls themselves." He paused. "The 2 youngest did not survive." Clara felt the words like a blow to the chest. 2 children, dead. In a cabin that should have been warm, that should have been safe, that had been built by a family with money and tools and community support, everything she had lacked. "Your children," Torgren said. They're alive? Yes. And the structure held? Yes. Torgrim looked at the walls around him, the dark slate, the careful joints, the 8 inches of stone that had absorbed 6 hours of fire and released it over 3 days of killing cold. I told you that you would freeze, he said. You did. I was wrong. He met her eyes. I have lived 16 winters in this place. I have seen men die who knew more about cold than I will ever know. And you, a woman alone, with nothing but river rock and stubbornness, you built something that held when proper buildings failed. He reached out and pressed his palm against the wall. The stone was cool now, the last of its stored heat finally exhausted. But the gesture was not about temperature. It was about acknowledgement. The slate holds heat, he said. Better than logs. Better than sod. Better than anything I've seen. He shook his head slowly. How did you know? Clara thought about the question. She thought about Thomas's stone tower by the river, 5 slabs stacked into a shape that should have fallen but didn't. She thought about the illustration of Irish beehive huts in a book she had seen once and mostly forgotten. She thought about the morning she had pressed her hand against the wall and felt the fire's warmth radiating back at her. I didn't know, she said. I just had nothing else to try. Torgrim nodded. It was perhaps the most honest answer she could have given. The Dahl family, he said. Henrik's wife is asking about your structure. Their cabin held, but the cold came through the chinking. She wants to know if you would teach her to build walls like these, to put inside their cabin, around the stove. Of course. And the Lindgren family, and the Petersons, and others. Torgrim's voice carried something that might have been wonder. Word is spreading. The woman who built a stone tent and lived when others died. They want to know how. Clara looked at her children, still sleeping under their pile of blankets, their faces peaceful despite everything. She looked at the walls she had built with bleeding hands and borrowed hope. She looked at Niels Torgrim, the man who had told her she would freeze, now sitting in her shelter asking her to teach others what she had learned. I'll show anyone who wants to know, she said. The stone is free. The knowledge should be too. The children's blizzard of January 1888 killed at least 235 people across Minnesota, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, and Montana. Some estimates place the toll above 500. The dead included the 2 Henriksen children Torgrim had mentioned, along with dozens of others in Carleton County alone, farmers caught in their fields, children lost between schoolhouses and homes, families who ran out of fuel and frozen cabins that everyone had believed were adequate. The territorial inspector Warren Hodge returned to Clara's claim in early February. He walked around the shelter that had survived the worst storm in a decade, examined the walls that had held when frame buildings failed, and made extensive notes. His report to the territorial government included a detailed description of the thermal mass principle Clara had discovered by accident, the ability of dense stone to absorb heat quickly and release it slowly. Garrett Price did not return. The Northern Pacific Railway, facing financial difficulties after the blizzard destroyed hundreds of its prospective customers, quietly withdrew its competing claim to Clara's quarter section. She received her final patent on the land in March of 1890, after completing the required 5 years of continuous residence. By then, 11 families in Carleton County had built interior slate walls based on Clara's design. The structures were not shelters. They were thermal batteries, installed inside existing cabins, absorbing heat from stoves during the day and radiating it through the night. Henrik Dahl's wife, Ingrid, became the most effective advocate for the technique, teaching it to Norwegian immigrant women who recognized in the slate walls an echo of the masonry stoves their grandmothers had used in the old country. Clara never charged for the knowledge. When families came to learn, she showed them the riverbank where the slate lay waiting, demonstrated the stacking technique that kept walls stable, explained the fire schedule that built maximum heat into the stone. She asked only that they pass the information on to others who needed it. The method spread beyond Carleton County. Settlers along the St. Louis River, in Duluth, in the Iron Range towns to the north, anyone with access to flat stone began experimenting with thermal mass heating. The principle was not new. European masonry heaters had used it for centuries, but Clara had rediscovered it under pressure, without training, without resources, without any reason to believe it would work except the absence of alternatives. She had built a tomb, and it had kept her alive. Clara Holbrook remained on her quarter section until 1912, when Thomas, by then a grown man with a family of his own, convinced her to move into a frame house he had built on the adjacent property. She was 58 years old, her hands still bearing the calluses of that first desperate construction, her back still aching on cold mornings from the 900 stones she had carried up from the river. She died in 1919 during the influenza epidemic that swept the country after the Great War. She was buried in the Thompson Cemetery next to a husband who had returned from Montana in 1894, broken and penniless, asking for forgiveness she had already decided to give. He had died in 1906, and she had mourned him with the complicated grief of a woman who remembered both the man who abandoned her and the father her children still loved. Elsa married a railroad engineer and moved to St. Paul. Thomas took over the family land and raised cattle on the ridge above the river. The original Slate shelter stood until 1923, when Thomas dismantled it to build a new barn. He saved several of the foundation stones, and his grandchildren later donated them to the Carleton County Historical Society, where they remain today. Dark gray slabs of Thompson Formation slate, still bearing the chisel marks of river ice and the faint residue of a fire that burned over a century ago. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind screamed at 50 miles per hour. The snow fell so thick that men died within sight of their own front doors, unable to find their way home. Niels Torgren, who had survived 16 Minnesota winters, had looked at Clara Holbrook and told her plainly, "You'll freeze, and those children will freeze with you." She did not freeze. Her children did not freeze. In a shelter built from river rock by a woman who had never lifted a stone heavier than a bread pan, they survived the worst blizzard in Dakota history, while frame cabins failed and proper families died. The last warmth left the walls sometime on the third night, when the fire had been dead for 40 hours and the storm still raged outside. But by then, the worst had passed. By then, Clara knew the stone had held long enough. She never forgot the feeling of pressing her hand against those walls in the darkness, waiting for the cold that should have killed them. She never forgot the heat that pushed back, faint, fading, but enough, just enough. The frontier remembers its dead. It carves their names into stone and counts them among the lost. But it also remembers the ones who refused to die, the women who built tombs that became shelters, who carried stones until their hands bled, who survived because they had nothing left to try except the thing that everyone said was impossible. Clara Holbrook's slate walls still stand in the Carleton County Museum, reassembled from the stones her son saved. They are cool to the touch now in the climate-controlled building that houses them. But on winter nights, when the docents have gone home and the lights have dimmed, visitors sometimes say the stones feel warmer than they should, as if they remember, as if they are still holding heat from a fire that burned 130 years ago, in a stone triangle by a frozen river where a woman and 2 children waited for a dawn that the world had told them would never come.